and I'd like to welcome you to the Montgomery College Presidential Dialogue Series. Thank you all for coming out this morning. This is the third year of the series, and as you probably know, this year's focus is on the politics of radical inclusion. I'm proud that our company has been the media sponsor of this series for 2 years. In my job, I regularly get to interact with our many community leaders who work day and night to make Montgomery County a place where everyone is welcomed and embraced. Nobody works harder or is more effective at that than DeRionne Pollard, who has made radical inclusion her mantra. Dr. Pollard is an outspoken and eloquent defender of access to education and an advocate for the college's nearly 60,000 students. She inspires us all to do better and to do more. And she serves as a powerful role model for the students and staff at Montgomery College. In case you don't know, Dr. Pollard is a first-generation college graduate who went on to earn a PhD in educational leadership and policy studies and has served as the president of the college for 9 years. She is originally from Chicago, which is also Secretary Duncan's first home, so I have a feeling there will be some discussion today about Chicago public schools and maybe the Chicago Cubs.
White Sox.
White Sox, oh, sorry. And I thought you were perfect, maybe not so much. I unfortunately have to leave to go to be at another event, but I wanted to be here this morning to support this wonderful series and all that Montgomery College and Dr. Pollard do for our community. Thank you again for being here this morning. It's now my pleasure to introduce Nikki Gorn of the Meyer Foundation, who will welcome Secretary Duncan. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm honored to be here today to represent the Meyer Foundation and to introduce our special guest. I do want to start by thanking Dr. Pollard for your vision and your leadership here at Montgomery College and across the region on issues of educational equity. And I really appreciate the invitation to be here today and to support this series. The Meyer Foundation's mission is to invest in solutions that build an equitable Washington region. One of our major goals towards a vision of a region where systemic racism and its consequences no longer exist is to eliminate disparities based on race in educational outcomes for our region's youth. For us, this means reframing our approaches from primarily focusing on remedial programs and equal access to identifying ways the education system itself must incorporate an equity lens to meet our youth where they are and support them over the finish line to higher education or a career. And so I'm particularly excited to introduce and hear from our guest today, the Honorable Arne Duncan, former U.S. Secretary of Education under President Obama. A tireless proponent of radical inclusion, Secretary Duncan has braved the wilds of city, state, and national politics to ensure that every student in our nation has access to high-quality public education. Secretary Duncan is currently the managing partner at the Emerson Collective, an organization dedicated to removing barriers to opportunities so people can live to their full potential. Its work centers on education, immigration reform, the environment, and other social justice initiatives. He graduated magna cum laude from Harvard University with a degree in sociology. He was also co-captain of Harvard's basketball team and has played professionally overseas. I have heard it said that Secretary Duncan has a theory that by watching someone play pickup basketball, you can learn everything you need to know about the type of person that they are. While I might not have the same appreciation of basketball, I do believe that you can tell everything you need to know about a person by their commitment to equity. Secretary Duncan has famously said that, quote, "In America, there is no reason that a kid born in one place should not have the same opportunities as a kid born in another." During his tenure, Secretary Duncan visited 50 schools in all 50 states to promote public investment in education, recruit new teachers, and raise college enrollment through increases to Pell Grants. As evidenced by every step in his career, his commitment to educational equity, like that of President Pollard and Montgomery College, is unwavering. And with that, I am extremely honored to ask you to join me in welcoming the Honorable Arne Duncan.
Well, thank you so much, Steve and Nikki, for those wonderful introductory comments, and I'm delighted to welcome each and every one of you to today's dialogue, and certainly to welcome our keynote presenter here, the Honorable Arne Duncan. I feel almost like he's a friend when he walks in. Those of you who were in the front when you got to meet him, he has this very unassuming style. Just kind of comes in, hey, how you doing? How you doing? And it's a very warm and comforting type of thing. So I'm looking forward to this dialogue, and I think you'll enjoy it as well. Just to give you a little bit of layout of how we're going to do this, we are on a very strict hard cut at 10:15 because we were able, and because he cares about Montgomery College and the work we do, Mr. Duncan was able to fit us in to some scheduled meetings, but he has to leave at 10:15. So the way we've arranged this is about to 9:45 or so, he and I will have a series of discussions or questions I have. Just so you know, those of you who've been to these before, I have a series of planned questions. Then he gave me liberty in the back. He said, ask me whatever you want to ask. I said, what? He said, whatever you want to ask. I said, what about this, this, and this? He said, oh yeah, you can go there. And I said, oh, okay, I'll be going there. So I'm excited about our dialogue. And at 9:45, we'll invite questions from the audience. I will ask you to be as succinct and brief as you can so we can get as many in. There are 2 microphones on each aisle, which, speaking of, we need to put an aisle in the middle of this room. We'll talk about that another day. But we will spend that time having some rich dialogue with each other and then end at that point. The last thing that I will say is that it's always important, I think it'd be neat for Arne to know who's in the audience. So how many of you are Montgomery College students? How many of you are Montgomery College faculty or staff? How many of you are community members? How many of you are in education? Very good. How many of you are political insiders? Very good. So this is just a little bit of a array so you'll know, Arne, who's in the audience, and we are delighted. So I'm going to start off with a question that I asked you, I said to Arne, what are you doing right now? And he launched into a thoughtful, very passionate response about the work he's doing right now at the Emerson Collective. So maybe I can start there and ask you to tell me a little bit about, you've left the administration, you kind of left quasi-political life and moved into this different space where I think you're doing, transformational work with communities and young people. Can you talk a little bit about what you're doing right now?
Sure, and thanks so much for having me. This is a real honor. I'm a huge fan of Montgomery College, huge fan of your leadership, and it's look forward to having, and again, please ask anything. I mean that very sincerely. I want to have a real serious conversation. So I grew up like you on the south side of Chicago, and I 13, 14, 15 started to play basketball everywhere on the south and west sides, and had people who sort of helped protect me and help get me in and out of neighborhoods. And I started to lose friends to gun violence when I was a teen. And I think that shapes you and maybe more honestly scars you in some ways. A little bit hard to talk about. So this issue of gun violence is not a new one. I'm not getting young. I'm 54 now, so that's 40 years roughly that I've been dealing with that. When I led Chicago Public Schools, lots I'm proud about. We can talk about successes, talk about challenges, but on my watch during my 7.5 years leading Chicago Public Schools, on average, we had a child killed every 2 weeks due to gun violence. It's a staggering rate of loss. Never in school, but Starkeisha Reed at 7:30 in the morning in her living room, killed by an AK-47, getting ready for school. Blair Holt, 2:30 in the afternoon, going home on a bus. And I felt like, I don't want to say I felt, I knew that we failed to keep our kids safe. And I've always been an educator, always will be an educator, but it's hard to educate kids who are dead. And it's hard to educate kids who are living with the kind of trauma that our kids are. When my family and I left Chicago to come to DC in 2009, I thought we were rock bottom. I thought it couldn't get worse. And for a whole host of reasons we can talk about if you want, things got a lot worse in the 7 years that we were here. So for me going home, this was the crisis facing the city. Chicago gave me everything, educationally, athletically, socially, culturally, and to go back and not deal with a crisis just didn't feel right. Not to overwhelm people with numbers and data, but Chicago's 7 times more violent than New York, 3.5 times more violent than LA. Very few crimes get solved in Chicago. There's something called the clear rate, which I'm obsessed with. The clear rate, that's percent of crimes that get solved. I don't have 2018. For 2017, the clear rate for for homicide, for murder in Chicago, was 17%. So 83% of homicides go unsolved. The clear rate for shootings, if you don't kill them, you shoot them, that's like 4 to 5%. And I know that if more of those victims look like me, and less those victims look like you, we would have a very different sense of urgency about doing something to preserve life. So what I'm doing now is Chicago, as you know as well as I do, is a tale of multiple cities. 75% of the violence is in 15 neighborhoods on the south and west sides. 75 to 80% of those shooting and being shot, the profile is identical. It's young black men, 17 to 24. So we are hiring those young men most at risk of shooting or being shot. We work with them for about a year. We have amazing life coaches, guys who come from the street life and who come out the other side to really help work with them that are just extraordinary. Hard and soft skills, substance abuse, trauma care. We have our guys write their autobiographies and do public readings in places like this that are really unbelievably powerful. We've had lots and lots of guys get their high school diplomas, and then we spin them off into the legal economy after about a year with us and just trying to give them a path out of the street life, which unfortunately almost inevitably leads to violence and onto something else.
I love the fact that the work that you're doing recognizes both the complexity of the environment in which many of these young people are living, but also the complexity of the life they will lead after that. So there isn't a quick solution one way or the other. And you know, I'm born and raised in Chicago. Grew up on the south side, South Inglewood, Auburn area. Was a proud graduate of Chicago public school system. I went to my neighborhood, K-12, K-8, and then went to one of the schools that you talked about in the book briefly, Whitney Young, and was very fortunate because I managed of 3 kids in my 8th grade graduating class to be accepted into Whitney Young. Actually 4 of us, all 4 girls, left Clara Barton Elementary School and went to Whitney Young. And I would say that our lives are profoundly different because we had that opportunity, because I know where a lot of the kids who I grew up with, where they ended, thanks to social media, some of us are still connected, but some of them I also know that we attended funerals, and I know that their lives and the lives of their families are significantly impacted as a result of that. So what's at the root of the issue? Because when we think about, I know, here's your Pulitzer right here. When you think about Chicago, you think about New York, you think about Baltimore right up the road, you think about all these large urban areas where you have lots of brown and black children in a system that oftentimes doesn't feel designed for them, doesn't seem committed to their outcomes and success, and more often than not is unable to help fulfill their role in what we want them to do. What do you think is going on there? That wasn't on my questions.
Yeah, no, this is a conversation we need to have, and obviously these are my personal opinions. I'm happy to be wrong and happy to be, debated or rebutted or whatever. Lots of folks say, "Oh, Arne, it's so nice you're giving people a second chance in life," and I actually basically reject that. I think in the vast majority of cases with our young men, we're giving them a first chance in life, and I can tell you a million crazy stories of guys, but one of our guys, said, "Arne, my earliest memory was of my dad shooting heroin." Like that's his earliest childhood memory, was his dad shooting heroin. Another guy said, "I grew up in a household full of guns, and I wish we would have had some toys." And books, and we had guns. And I grew up, both my parents were educators, and I became an educator. The people in his family were shooters, and he became a shooter. And I think every institution in their lives failed them. Their families, the schools, the churches, the nonprofits, the social service agencies. And I always start by apologizing that we're getting to you very, very late in life. And I wish we were there much earlier. It was never too late, but you had a chance. I had a chance. A lot of our guys, they didn't really have a chance. Youngest guy told me he started selling drugs at 9 years old. And he said, "Arne, it was really hard to sell drugs as a 9-year-old. I'm like, "I bet that was." Many, not all of our guys are the eldest in their family, and it's really interesting, I'm the eldest of 3. And 12, 13 years old, mom's on crack or an alcoholic, dad's locked up or gone, and they have to start making some money. They have to make money to eat. They have to make money to take care of younger siblings. And all of us in comfortable places like this are absent from their lives, and there's one guy hiring. That's the guy in the corner. And those guys are always hiring. There's never a we're full sign. There's always a job for a little guy to be a lookout, to be a runner, to do whatever. And clothes, food, money, love, shelter, a couch to sleep on, they're there. And those 12 and 13-year-olds make, and I've learned so much every day, but you learn not to judge. They make a rational choice because there are no other choices. With us now, 10 years later, they're making another rational choice. No one has to work with us. No probation officer assigns anyone. No court assigns anyone. They're just making a second rational choice in their life. And I'm the eldest of 3, like I said. And we had food, we had shelter, we had books, we had clothes. Had I not had those things, I can't say I would have. If I felt I had to take care of my brother and sister, I can't say I would have done something different. So this work is unbelievably humbling. But that's the genesis of the challenge. Is those, and this is a small percent of guys and women, but these are the ones, when everyone else lets them down, this is the path they go, and unfortunately that path, like I said, almost inevitably leads to a level of violence that's pretty extraordinary.
It's interesting that you couch that response almost in describing Maslow's hierarchy. To a certain extent, if one does not have adequate shelter, fooding, they don't feel safe, they don't feel that there is someone who has a vested interest in their success, they never get to self-actualize in a way that we might think is productive citizens, but they self-actualize by making rational choices that allow them to survive. The economics of this, I think, is very profound in terms of what you say. So we often talk about this idea of the opportunity gap. Sometimes we call it the achievement gap. I think we sanitized it because we want to now say it's about opportunity. And in your first chapter, you say that in America, there is no reason that a kid born in one place should not have the same chances and opportunities as a kid born in another. So when we think about this in terms of Chicago, Montgomery County, whatever the case may be, why do you think we continue to allow these different opportunities to exist? I can remember early on in my career reading Jonathan Kozol's Savage Inequalities. It looked at the Illinois funding structure of the K-12 space. And a lot of it is based on funding, how we choose to allocate taxes. In your book, you talk about this whole issue of local control as well. Can you talk a little bit about what do you think is at the root of some of this opportunity gap?
And again, happy to be wrong, happy to have a conversation, but I always try to be honest, or better or worse, my honest opinion is that far too many of us in America, we care about our own children, but we don't care about our neighbors' children. And so as long as ours are good, we're good. And we care less about our neighbors' kids. And until we start to care about our neighbors' kids, we will have these massive inequalities. So in a country where K-12 education is 10% of the money comes from the federal, usually 40 to 50% from the state, and usually 40 to 50% locally, local property taxpayers, the children of the wealthy by definition, get dramatically more spent on them than the children of the poor. So the children who have the most get the most, and the children of the poor, children who have the least get the least. Many of you probably live in Montgomery County because you have a pretty good tax base and you have some great public schools here. That's a really, really rational choice to make. But there's a huge challenge in our country. When I ran the Chicago public schools, 90% of my children were students of color, 85% lived below the poverty line. We received less than half the money each year, than kids who live 5 miles north of us in Lake Michigan, along Lake Michigan, in Winnetka and Wilmette. You think about the compounding impact, pre-K, K, first through 12, 14 years of less than half the resources. And you wonder, paying teachers less after-school programs, less summer programs, less access to technology. And you think about the massive inequities, and that's what it's my passion, but it's what drives me crazy, is that education should be the great equalizer. That's the dream of education in America, and in some places it is, but in many places, education actually exacerbates the divide between the haves and the have-nots. And I think as a nation, we're feeling that, and it's not just a white-black thing. It's a rural, it's a remote, it's a Native American reservation situation, and our country, I think, is absolutely divided along lines of educational opportunity. And a lot of the anger you're feeling in this country is coming from people who feel left out. I think it starts because of their lack of educational opportunity. So for me, it's not just about education. It's not just about ending poverty, although that's sort of been my driving mission. But it's like, I feel like our democracy's fraying right now. And unless we take this much more seriously, we will start to have, if we don't have already, a caste system. And that's a huge challenge to a democracy.
One of the things, one of our council members here, Craig Rice, who is the head of the Education Committee, often makes the statement that education and funding education should be the first function of government.
Yeah.
And I'm proud to live in a county that spends roughly 50% of its budget each year on funding our K-12 system. As a result of that, I think that we have a fairly competitive system where my son, who's a student in our public school system, is thriving, and I think that there's certainly large swaths of our student population that are thriving, and there are lots of others who are not. One of the things I think is at the root of this, and you spend a lot of time, and you just mentioned this compounding effect, and particularly around the issue of teachers. And I want to talk a little bit about that. In a passage in the book, you said, the vast majority of teachers are heroes who are defying the odds. After parents, teachers are the most important people in a child's life. Teachers deserve so much more than they get by way of training, respect, support, and compensation. Can you talk a little bit about why you feel this way?
Sure. I think we should double salaries for teachers. We should double the salaries for principals.
I knew I'd get you some applause.
Yeah, we say teaching is a profession. We say teachers are professionals, but like I said, we don't train them like that. We don't reward them. We don't pay them like that. We don't have meaningful career ladders. And that's the biggest determinant of kids' success. I talk in the book, we debate test scores, all that kind of stuff, but I talk about this massive study that Raj Chetty, a Harvard economist, did. It looked at decades of data, millions of student records out of New York City. And he found that one good teacher in middle school raised the lifetime earnings of that class by $250,000. So this has nothing to do with test scores or whatever. This is just having an adult who believes in you and sees something in you that maybe you don't have in yourself. It's about compounding effects. Think if you have 3 good teachers in a row. And the converse of that is think if you have 3 not so good teachers in a row.
Exactly.
And how far behind you are there. And so if we were really, really serious, we would elevate the profession in some very, very different ways. And then I would say, again, these are hard conversations, but not every algebra teacher is the same. Not every biology teacher is the same. And what do we do to make sure that the students who need the best teachers and the principals have them? And again, we always talk about local control, and I push a little bit. So 15,000 school districts, that's pros and cons to that across America, but the theory of that is these 50,000 school districts, they should be laboratories of innovation. And so I traveled to hundreds and hundreds of schools all over the country, every state. And I always ask this one question: show me one school district out of 15,000 that systemically identifies their most successful, their most committed principals and teachers, and then matches them with their most underserved communities. And in 15,000 school districts, not one does that. Not one does that. So if we truly believe teachers matter, if we truly believe great principals matter, if we truly believe kids who come from disadvantaged communities need the best, then we would match those two.
Okay, so let's go in deep. Why don't we do it? Let's name it.
We
Why
lack
don't we
courage.
do it? Why?
We lack courage.
So, because what type of courage does it take to do that?
It's 2 kinds. So this is why it doesn't happen. We need to go there. One is we don't like in education to identify talent. We don't like to say who the great teachers are, who the great principals are.
Isn't that actually really ironic? You think about most other major professions, you have a healthcare issue.
Yeah.
You want to find the best physician or specialist in that issue.
Yeah.
Your car needs some type of repair. You want to find the best who does that.
Yeah.
Why is that almost an anathema in education?
Because we're scared of those conversations. Because I think you're scared if you're going to name the top, you also have to name the bottom. And we treat everyone as like it's just work. Everyone's a factory worker. Everyone's just working on an assembly line. It's all okay. And when I would go to California has 300,000 teachers, 300,000. And I would always say, your top 10%, your top 30,000 aren't just great teachers for California. They are world-class teachers. Your bottom 10%, bottom 30,000, maybe they should find another profession. Maybe they should be teaching. So 300,000, 30,000 at the top, 30,000 at the bottom, and no one in California can tell you who is anywhere on that. So that's the first challenge. The second challenge, and this is a equally hard one, is I think often in our country we don't truly believe that black and brown kids or poor kids can be successful. That actually some interventions, some strategies, some great teachers, some great after-school programs could really make a difference. And that inherent, whether it's bias or racism or low expectations or whatever you want to call it, that prevents us from doing what the right thing is for those kids. And then the third one is, again, that we'll look out for our own, but we won't quite look out for the others. And families in those communities don't have the power to do it for themselves.
So how do we, because I think to me is very potent, this idea of community building to do this work. And I was struck by your conversation earlier about your work at the Emerson Collective, this idea of, I said, first of all, I was wondering, do you have community colleges actively engaged in that work? But then that whole safety net that oftentimes surrounds the educational system, and this idea of having communities demand and expect more of their school system, of their government, of the people who are their informal and formal leaders. I'm always struck by our inability to build capacity there. So in the book, you tell that wonderful story about when you were closing 3 schools, and you actually had to go in and have the conversation with the community. And part of what was interesting about that, the community didn't know the data about their particular school, but then when you pose some very thoughtful questions to them about those outcomes and their own expectations around those outcomes, it changed and swayed the conversation. So do you have thoughts about how we build community capacity in these spaces to really hold leaders, formal and informal, to higher standards around this work?
I think it's one of a couple areas in sort of the education reform movement where we've done a terrible job of investing. And I think while it's great to bring in great teachers and great principals, ultimately what's going to change in this country is exactly what you said. The parents are demanding it. It's got to be not top down, not heroic leadership, but bottom up. And that demand and that accountability and that partnership. And because we haven't invested in parent organizations, because we haven't talked to families and shared the data, every parent, rich, poor, educated, not educated, every parent wants the best for their kids. It's hard to want something that you've never seen. It's hard to fight for something that you've never experienced. And because we haven't invested in organizing those families and giving them a seat at the table. So what we did in Chicago is we started taking families to visit schools that sometimes were like less than a mile away, like the same, heart of the South Side, heart of the West Side, but radically different results. And you just don't know where all the social isolation is so powerful. And again, it wasn't going to California or Montgomery County to see a great school. It was going in your neighborhood to see a great school. And that light bulb going on changes everything. But you have to see it. You have to be able to touch it. And that, I think, is a massive miss, and we have to continue to push there. I'm all for good policies and top-down leadership, but at the end of the day, you have to put parents in a position to advocate and listen to them for what's right for their kids. And if that were to truly happen, we would be in a much, much better place as a country.
So as a country, we seem to be moving in this direction of really supporting charter schools, this idea that public education has failed us. We don't want to invest in it at the levels at which we should be investing. If you look at different states across the country, it's actually alarming to watch what's happening in terms of the redistribution of public resources from public school systems into charter school systems with the idea that these school systems are better able to serve vulnerable or at-risk populations. I'd love to hear some of your thinking about what do you think is causing this phenomenon, and is it a appropriate response to what you think is happening?
Yeah, so at the end of the day, for me, huge debates, public versus charter versus whatever, and charter schools are public schools, and for me, I'm just really pragmatic. I just want good schools for kids. And I would say if you're a seventh grader or a second grader, 7 years old, you don't really know if your school's a charter or traditional or Magna or IB. Do I have a great teacher? Am I safe? Does my principal care about me? We need schools that look like that. So I've been in some unbelievable charter schools. There are, 99% of the kids are poor and 95% are graduating from high school and 95% of them going to college. And I've been to some not so good charter schools. Same is true for traditional public schools. And I think we need to get past the adult debate of this versus that label. Where we're seeing success, we got to support it, replicate it, learn from it, share those lessons, not be competitive, not be proprietary, not keep things secret. And where we're not seeing success, whether it's a traditional or charter, we need to challenge that status quo, because kids get one chance to get education. They can't wait 10 years for a place to get its act together. We need to move with some real urgency, like it's our own kids at that. Your son, my daughter, my son at those schools. And so I think charter schools, they're always going to be a tiny percent of schools. I think they've emerged often in poor urban areas where families have felt not well served. What I will always say is no child is ever assigned to a charter school. Like if they don't do a good job educating, they just disappear. No one ever, this is your neighborhood school. And for whatever reason, many parents are choosing to send their children to those schools. Some with some fantastic success, some less so.
So I want to transition a little bit to this outside of the system, but this idea of the person that takes to do this work. So you made some tough decisions when you actually made first a tough decision to become the superintendent of Chicago Public Schools. And and I love how you said that even though you knew you would fail, in fact, you write that, quote, it would have been easier to stay on the outside and keep complaining about how bad the system was. I'm highlighting this because I've been doing a lot of work, as I shared with you, I was on sabbatical and I came back, and spending a lot of time on a bit of a campaign people have been saying to everyone to bring their whole selves to work and to really be intentional around the vulnerability it takes to do this work, the uncomfortableness of it, but the richness that comes from that growth process. That means that you also brought a level of your own vulnerability to this work when you do it each and every day. Can you say something about that decision to actually take on the leadership of the Chicago Public Schools? I love the story. You talk about the mayor's wife and then the mayor coming to talk to you, the different conversation there. But why you were willing to choose the tougher of two options?
I'll back up a little bit because I can only explain it by giving a little bit of my history. So grew up as a part of my mother's after-school program that was less than 2 miles from our house. We grew up in middle class, integrated Hyde Park. My dad taught at the University of Chicago. Her program, we lived on 56th Street. Her program was on 46th Street. We used to walk some days, but 47th Street was the barrier between middle class, integrated Hyde Park and all black, all poor North Kentwood, Oakland. And seeing all my life, she raised my sister and brother and I as a part of her program. It was this unbelievably formative experience. We've all tried to follow in her footsteps. She did that work for 52 years until her health gave out. Seeing the disparity in opportunity between what me and my friends had during the school day and what my friends in the afternoon had, that unfairness, that's given all three of us, that's our life's work, is trying to close that gap. So my first real job after playing basketball was running an I Have a Dream program with my sister. We worked out of the same church basement as my mom. During that time, we started a new, small, not charter, but traditional Chicago public school, Arrow Community Academy, in the neighborhood, right across the street from the church where my mother worked, because the neighborhood didn't have a good public school. And so the truth is, most of my life, the public schools where we worked were honestly the enemy. Like, my mother was always trying to do at night from 3 o'clock to 8 o'clock what wasn't happening during the school day. And my sister started our program, we were trying to do in the evenings what wasn't happening. We started a group of 6th graders, and they had no homework. There was never any. We thought we were going to do homework help after school. We had to create our own curriculum because there literally was no work. There were no expectations. With our I Have a Dream program, we had 40 kids. With the schools, it grew, we were going to have 400 kids. CPS, when I started there, had 400,000, and the math of it was interesting to me. And what I basically decided is if you want to have scale, if you want to have impact, you have to go inside. But it's easy to critique from the outside. It's easy for me to spend my life saying all the things that aren't working. And it's harder to try and go in and see if you can turn the ship just a little bit. But that felt like an amazing opportunity to try and have impact at scale and try and take the lessons I had learned all my life working with my mother and try and see if you could help not 40 or not 400, but 400,000. So I went in with a huge amount of trepidation and had some culture shock and all kinds of battles, but it was the best move I ever made, and it changed my life.
I love the fact that your mother's legacy and her progeny are advancing. There's a generational impact, and it goes back to the idea you talked about earlier of compounding interest. So here's this idea that your mother, I think, and your father have developed this seed about what leadership is in the education space, how you work to transform communities and family, and then our children are doing the very same thing. I think that's a very powerful concept to think about. What are some of the legacies we teach our children about our educational systems and about the things that are important to them? We try to prepare students at Montgomery College for the future of work. Here at Montgomery College, I know that you're attuned to a lot of the things that happen in the K-12 space, but also this relationship between K-12 and higher education and this unique space I think that community colleges offer. You say that kids need to, quote, be able to learn anything and continue to be able to learn anything for the rest of their lives. We need kids who can think, not just recall. I'm interested in hearing you talk a little bit about what that looks like as we think about the future of work and why that's so important.
Yeah, well, the world is changing every day, as everyone here knows, and so how we educate has to be so different. You probably did. I spent a lot of time memorizing things when I was a kid. You got tested on, could you remember this river or this battle or this war, whatever. You can Google most of those things these days. But can you synthesize information? Can you draw conclusions? Can you think critically? Can you work as part of a diverse team to solve problems? And so, you have to be able to read, you have to be able to write, you have to be able to do math. There's certain things. But it's honestly, for me, it's the habits of mind are more important because the skills and the knowledge are going to change so fast. So for me, are we willing to learn the rest of it? Do we love to learn? Do we love to continue to challenge ourselves? If you think you've mastered algebra after a year and you're done with that, it's not going to work that way. So how are we training people to love to solve problems, to be comfortable and confident working with others, to be critical thinkers? And I think the nature of work, so some jobs are going away, and that's very scary. I think work is about solving problems. And last time I checked, we have no shortage of problems. Like I wish we were running out of problems to solve, but we're not quite there yet. The question for us in education is, are we equipping young people with the skills to solve problems? And if we're doing that, then again, I think they're going to be wildly successful. But if they don't have those habits of mind, if they don't have those traits, then they're going to struggle. They're going to struggle in this changing economy, and that's a very scary place to be.
Which I think, going to a comment you made earlier, is actually at the root of some of this the challenge to the American democracy right now, this inability to move and gyrate and respond to this changing economy. So there are some people who are simply being left behind because they are unprepared for the types of work that are required now. And therefore, we've almost cultivated this almost anti-intellectualism, this anti-higher education perspective that, doggone it, you've got these, and everything's this clear bifurcation. And I think the reality is that everything is probably and truthfully somewhere in between. I'm often put in a position where I'm trying to figure out how to respond to those folks who are struggling or who are critiquing higher education, I think unfairly, in some spaces, and sometimes fairly, because as much as we tout ourselves as being agile and flexible, we are the ivory tower in a lot of ways, so we tend to want to preserve that. What do you think is at the root, and it's just my hypothesis, but I'd love to hear what you think is at the root of this anti-higher education, this fear that somehow we're indoctrinating people, but we aren't preparing them for work and all of this?
Yeah, well, maybe come in a different way. If I
Yeah.
don't answer it, push back on me. But for me, it's always this like false debate of, again, charter versus traditional. We just need more good schools. So for me, it's like, are we preparing kids for college or for the world of work? And the truth is we need both.
Both, right.
We need a hell of a lot more young people prepared to be successful in college, particularly from disadvantaged poor communities. And we need a lot more people prepared for the world of work. And guess what? Those skills are basically identical. It's not two different paths. I'm never about tracking at 13 you're going to work, or you're not college material, you are. It's just giving young people opportunities to figure out what their passion is, what's their interest, and how we train them for the next generation of jobs. So I think there is fear, and when there's fear, there's anger, and that anger gets displayed in different ways. Some of the critique may be fair, some of it isn't fair. We need a lot more people going to college. We need a lot more people, yes, in the STEM fields, but in the liberal arts. We need a lot more people who are, as a proud sociology major.
Yeah.
We need all, it's not like we're running out of that. And we need a lot more people prepared to enter the world of work at 19, 20, and 21 with those technical skills to be successful. And as I have to tell you this, there are a lot of community colleges that are like regional economic engines. 18-year-olds, 38-year-olds, 58-year-olds coming back to retrain and retool. I love visiting community colleges. It's like baby UNs. It's like this massive humanity coming to better themselves and better their families and take that next step. So for me, those are often false debates. We should be very self-critical and look in the mirror, and are we relevant? Are we helping people take that next step? But we have to create opportunity for places that haven't had it, that have been locked out. And so again, how do you open the doors to higher education in those communities? How do you open the doors to the world of work? Through community colleges. And when those communities aren't touched, that's when that anger is real, and that fear is real, and it's a rational fear. Those families should be scared because they are being left behind. That's real. I thought poverty on the South and West Sides, I thought I knew that. You go to Appalachia and McDowell County and Coal Country, which I did in my bus tour. You go to Native American reservations where there's 75% unemployment. That's a very different level of poverty than I was used to.
It's like you need a different word than poverty, don't you? It seems, I think because it's so profound, and I think the average American doesn't even understand what that means.
Right.
So I don't know what the word is, but I'm bound and determined to figure it out.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's a great point. When your family has worked in coal for 3, 4, 5 generations, and there is no more coal, and you have a president promising coal's coming back, that's a dishonest promise, but you're desperate. You're desperate, and no one else is offering a better solution. So you latch on to a false hope.
I'm going to ask one more question before I turn it over to the audience. So if you want to start making your way to the microphone, I encourage that. You, in your book, talk about children who lived on the Mexican side of the border, but were born in a U.S. hospital, so were really U.S. citizens, and they attended school in the U.S. and then crossed back to sleep in their parents' house and live in Mexico after school. And you actually visited this school while you were the Secretary of Education. How does this experience inform your thoughts about immigration policy and, of course, the wall proposed by President Trump? We have about 600 DACA students here at our institution, and we benefit significantly from their presence here. So I'm interested to hear a little bit more about what your thoughts are. Yeah,
so again, happy to talk about successes in DC, but one of the two, in my mind, our greatest failures was in the space of immigration reform. And for me, that would have meant financial aid for Dreamers. And the fact that during our 8 years, we were not able to provide Pell Grants to DACA students is heartbreaking. And as a country, we just cut off our nose to spite our face. I'm so thrilled that you're working with so many, and I've worked with a bunch of groups doing private scholarship dollars, but these are young people who are community leaders, great students, sometimes valedictorians. They're going to be job creators, they're going to be entrepreneurs, they're going to be innovators. They're going to drive our economy and strengthen our country. And to somehow lock them out after high school and push them to the shadows and say you can't go to college, it makes no sense whatsoever. So that was, again, a huge failure during our time here in DC was our inability to get financial aid to Dreamers. So visiting that school was unbelievably profound. I mean, it's just a microcosm. It's a really, really powerful story. But these were families that were living the American dream as best they could. And these are families that are, abject poverty, without running water. They have to, some of the kids have to show them how to hold a pencil when they come to school. Parents can never visit the school because they're not allowed in the country. So they do parent-teacher conferences by Skype with a local restaurant that opened its doors. And but they want something better for their kids. And so they're willing to sacrifice never going to a parent-teacher conference and never going to a play because they want something better. It was deep.
That is. So I will go, we've got some questions. I'll go to this side first, and then we'll go to this. Can you speak directly into the microphone? Thank you.
Hello, my name is Aaron Kershaw. I write for the Montgomery College Advocate. Thank you for coming, by the way, Secretary Duncan. I just wanted to ask you, mass shooting seems to be like a real threat that our children live over because, tragedies like Sandy Hook and other tragedies. I wanted to ask you, what did you think about this administration's job of pulling together gun safety with public school safety, and whether or not you feel like they're doing a good job of addressing both those issues together?
Great question.
Let me say a couple things. So there's an understandable and important focus on mass shootings that are way too prevalent in our country, but it's the daily shootings in places like my hometown of Chicago and Dr. Pollard's hometown of Chicago that drives the vast majority of violence in our country. So we need to talk about, yes, mass shootings, but also just daily gun violence. So a school in Englewood where you grew up, spent time, Urban Prep, it's a school for young men there, amazing school. All the young guys come to school, shirt and tie, suit and tie. That school has had 14 of their young men killed. Not a mass shooting, not a whatever, just the daily reality of life on Chicago's South Side. So we have to look at them both. What this administration has done is to not talk about gun violence. To do a task force about school safety and not talk about gun violence is totally dishonest. It's intellectually dishonest. I'm pretty radical on this issue given my life experience. I think the current administration is bought and owned by the NRA. The job of the NRA is to sell more guns and create fear. And I just think we need a lot less guns in our country, not more. And I've said this, I think we value our guns more than we value our kids in our country. And you can go Australia, where my wife is from, England, Canada, Japan. They have a tiny, tiny percent of the gun violence that our nation has because they choose to value lives and choose to allow their kids to grow up free of fear and free of trauma. And not to go on too long, my wife is actually from Tasmania. Tasmania had a horrific mass shooting a year or two after we moved to the United States. They basically got rid of the guns in Australia. It was actually interesting. It was a conservative prime minister who did it. He ended up actually losing his job in part over this. But for 20 years in Australia, they went without a single mass shooting, not one. They had one recently. That was the gift they gave to that generation. And mass shootings have become almost daily here. So they made a public policy choice and had a different outcome. We make different public policy choices, we have a different outcome. And I just wonder why leaders in other countries value their kids more than we do in the United States.
Thank you.
Good, Sal.
Mr. Duncan, thank you for attending this session today. It's been very informative. My name's Fred Evans. Had a little of experience in the Montgomery County Public Schools. I was there for 30 years. My last 12 years, I was principal of a middle school and high school, Parkland Middle School and Gaithersburg High. And I had just one very basic question, and that is, I hear a lot about leadership and how we get, quote, the best principal into the most difficult schools. What are some real programs that either have been done or can be done to not only hire the best principals, but maintain them in the appropriate locations? And I could talk for hours on this. I won't, and I'll allow you to answer the question. Thank you.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for your service and your remarkable track record. Thanks for sticking with it. So I'll just give you one. Again, there aren't many examples of places that have done this, and how you sustain and provide the support and mentorship and a chance to refresh and keep learning and stay in these communities is a big deal. We talked about sabbatical, to think and to write a little bit. We never do that kind of stuff on the K-12 side. That's a higher ed thing. But I'll just give you one little example. Charlotte Mecklenburg, where they did a little bit of what I'm talking about. And they moved some principals, and they would move like 5 teachers, so not an entire school, into tougher communities. And I talked to a principal who had been at sort of a wealthier, more affluent place, was going to retire. He'd been in it 25, 30 years, and then was asked to go work in a much tougher part. And he said basically that it was the privilege of his career to do that. It was like the capstone of his career. So it wasn't like being sent to the worst place because you did something bad. And he said sort of what a privilege it was to end his career doing that work. And that's got to be the mentality, in Montgomery County, in Chicago, DC, LA, every place, is how do we recognize, identify, reward. And then one heroic principal can't do it, one heroic teacher can't do this, but how do you send a team to go do this really hard, really complex, important work, and do it in partnership with the community, not as some invading force. But it's got to be the capstone of educators' career to go work in Appalachia, to go work on a Native American reservation, to work in Anacostia, to work in Englewood or Austin back home in Chicago. And we just don't have those kinds of incentives. The incentives in Chicago were to go work in New Trier High School, because you got paid $20,000 or $30,000 or $40,000 more, and probably had a smaller size class. So again, if we were serious, that's the kind of calculation we would do. The final thing I'll say is, no educator goes into education to get rich. Money's not the motivating factor. It's to make a difference. And you want to put people in a position where they can make the biggest difference. And so again, how do you create those conditions? I'll give you one quick example I talked about in the book. The Academy of Urban School Leadership is training in a very different model. It's a residency model based on a medical model, where aspiring teachers spend a year with a master teacher learning the craft before they have their own classroom. They identify great teachers to become their principals and stay. And just there are other professions that we can learn from in education. I think do a much better job of talent identification, talent nurturing, talent mentorship.
Great one.
All right, Dr. Pollard, it's good to see you again.
Thank you.
And Secretary Duncan, thanks for being here, and I appreciate your service to our country as well. Last year, there were a lot of students who were excited about the school shooting, since there was one at Parkland last February. And some students has been asking some principals question about how to deal about the latest school shooting, since there were like millions of mass shootings across all over America. And well, the good news is that we had some like the school resource officers who are trying to make sure that kids are safe as well. But also, we've seen some of the teachers who are trying to march in West Virginia and California, because a lot of teacher says that they were dealing with issues about the strike pay. So what's the thing in order to do to make sure, like, we want to make sure that kids who are making sure they're safe at school, and as well as for making sure that teacher gets more paid to get another payback sum?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Two good questions. So let me be really clear. So school shootings are obviously horrific, but like 99.8% of shootings in America aren't in schools. And schools are often the safest place that kids, I talked about us losing a child every 2 weeks due to gun violence. Not once was that in the school. And school mass shootings, as you know, happen in malls, in libraries, in movie theaters, in concerts, in churches, in bars, on baseball fields. Mass shootings are an American phenomenon that happen everywhere. So the real honest answer that people don't want to hear is that you can't make schools safe as long as we're obsessed with guns. And we can talk about school resources. The NRA likes to talk about quote unquote hardening schools. How do you harden recess? How do you harden getting on the bus? How do you harden getting off the bus? How do you harden athletic contests? You can't do it. And so there's a lot of myth making here that until we deal with the issue of guns, our schools, our churches, our malls, our homes, our bars, our concerts are not going to be as safe as they are in other countries. That's the heart of the issue. On paying teachers more and funding it, I always say this is, for me, this is the challenge in America. And I think there are great ideas around education coming from the left and the right. No one has a monopoly on good ideas, liberals or conservatives, whatever. The challenge is no one votes on education. No one's held accountable. Mayors, governors, congressmen, senators, the president, no one's held accountable for increasing funding for pre-K, which I think is the best investment we can make, for paying teachers more, principals more after-school programs. And if more people voted around education across the political spectrum, we'd be in a much better place. And let me be clear, I don't blame politicians, I blame us as voters. If you watch the presidential debates, education doesn't get talked about. It doesn't get talked about, it breaks my heart, because no one votes on education. The midterms, the exit poll, 6% of people voted in education. So my plea to all of you and to your friends is, I don't care what your political ideology is, I really don't, vote based upon, in part, what those candidates you're voting for are going to do to increase educational opportunity in this country.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Hi, my name is Ken Wiener. I am a retired faculty member from Montgomery College. I taught here for 37 years, and for the last 10 or 11 years, I've continued working with at-risk young adults in the community. So there's just so much I wish I had the chance to just sit down and talk to you about for 2 hours, including hoops, by the way. You look like you're in shape.
He's a ball
If you're
player.
looking for a game.
I played last night.
But-
I played last night.
One of my concerns is the academic standards that I saw when I was here and that I continue to see now. And I know high school graduation rates are going up, but my concern is, are the students coming out of the schools correctly prepared? And so I just see, and I think if you talk to my colleagues now and before, they would confirm this, too many students that come out of high school with a degree that basically can't write very well, basic sentences, can't do basic math. I just tutored a kid who's come out of the Montgomery County school system a couple of days ago, literally could not do 10 times 5. And I see that kind of stuff all the time. So it's a dilemma because you're dealing with a lot of students, and I always have the sense that there's sort of this drive to move them through to graduation, because if they're not doing well, what are you going to do with them? How many students can you keep back? I'm just throwing it out as a question. How do you maintain reasonable standards for graduation so that when kids come out and they come to a Montgomery College or go to the workplace, they're really prepared? Because I see too many that I feel aren't in that situation.
So I start the book actually with a story of I took a year off from college to work with my mom full time and sort of figure out, was this going to be my life's work or not? And during that year, I tutored a young man who was 4 years younger than me. I was going to be a senior in college. He was going to be a senior in high school. He was a phenomenal basketball player, was trying to go to a big-time Division I school, asked for a little help, get ready for the ACT. I said, great, come in. And he was basically functionally literate. He was at about a second or third grade level. And he had been on the B honor roll. And he had no clue. He thought he was on track just to take off. And it was, we were talking about it backstage, it was one of those moments that changed my life. It's like he had played by all the rules. He had stayed out of the gangs, he didn't drink, he didn't smoke, he had gone to school, and he'd just been passed through the system. Maybe because he was a nice kid, maybe because he could, put a ball in the basket. And he had no chance to be successful in college and didn't have that happen. So one of the things we pushed, and we didn't get into it today, it was controversial and hard, and pros and cons of how we did it, but we pushed hard for high standards, sort of common core standards. Of what we were trying to say is that we just want anyone who graduates from a high school in Maryland, we just want, not a federal standard, we just want the University of Maryland to say that they can come to our university and not take remedial classes. Same in Texas, with the University of Texas, same in Wyoming. That was very radical. There's some things we could have done a little differently in rolling it out, but it was to fight this thing of passing kids through. We talk about college being too expensive. College is too expensive, that's real. What we don't talk about is we spend $9 billion a year on remedial education. That is college students paying college tuition to take high school classes for no credit. Nobody wins. The student, the university, us as taxpayers, no one wins. We don't have that conversation. You can say if you want, many community colleges, 60, 70, 80% of students have to start with remedial classes.
Montgomery College, about 60% of our students need remediation in math and about 30% need remediation in English and writing.
And again, this isn't a pretty affluent, pretty educated space.
Yeah.
Go to San Antonio, that's 80%. That's the conversation, Chicago's the same, that's the conversation we don't have. So I think we have to continue, to your point, to have high standards and be honest about that, but I always couple high standards with high support. What do we do not just to raise the bar, but give those young people a chance, again, great teachers, great after school, great summers, great Saturdays, to hit those higher standards. And the goal for me, yes, high school graduation rates are important. The goal is I want 100% of high school graduates to be able to go to college and take credit-bearing classes. That's the goal.
Thank you.
Okay, good morning, Dr. Pollard and
morning.
Secretary Duncan. I'd like to give a shout out first to your hometown of Chicago. Because of things that I read, Chicago has always been the leader in doing teacher studies and how they can better educate their students in K through 1. You know, I read something about the math program they used to have in the 60s and the 70s. So, yeah, so, you know, kudos to that. I like to know that my opinion is that you can't have equity without access. So what is your opinion about free community college tuition? I know California did it back in the 70s, 80s, and I lived there. And I know when I was in between jobs or when I went on job interviews for a job that I was interested in but was not qualified for, I just went right in and enrolled in a community college and got those skills. Got that accounting course. You know, got those, back then, shorthand, got those typing skills. And then, you know, free. Only thing I had to do was buy books. And so what is your thought on free tuition?
Yeah, so I talk about in the book, and again, you talk about ideas coming from the left and the right. So the place that I think has done this the best is Tennessee. And Tennessee's governor happens to be Republican. He's a guy I love, Governor Haslam. He took what was maybe more a traditional Democratic idea of free access to college for all, and he's made it happen for his state. And he didn't do this because it was a feel-good thing or he felt sorry for people. People need to develop skills. They need to go back to school, go back to community college if their skills become obsolete. And he's done an amazing job in a Republican conservative state of making this the norm. And so that example of Tennessee, I think is an example. We've had other places. San Antonio's done some interesting things. There's some cities, Chicago's done some interesting things. But as a state, Tennessee, led by a Republican governor, has done this hands down better than any other state in the country. It's an amazing model.
Good morning, and thank you very much for being here. This is a wonderful program. My name is Walter Lang, and I want to give a shout out to the Lifelong Learning Institute here at the college. It's a wonderful program for seniors. My question is, education properly should be a major focus, especially K-12 or pre-K-12. And there's emphasis upon being college ready or career tech education. And there's emphasis also on STEM, and there's increasing pressure that the schools provide financial literacy. You spoke of critical thinking. Citizenship is certainly important. A number of years ago, ethics became a major concern in schools of business after the Enron scandal. My goodness. And you talked a little bit about empathy as part of what's necessary to become educators. You spoke about the importance of going beyond how to think, but also, well, more important to think than just how to recall. So of all of that, recognizing that there are only 5 or 6 hours in the school day, how is a teacher to do all of that? And how is a student to be held accountable for all of that so that they can in fact be motivated to learn all of that? Or what are your priorities? Could you please respond?
So I would like to redefine, it's not just on a teacher. You think about schools. We got 100,000 schools in America. Rich neighborhoods, poor neighborhoods, black, white, Latino, Asian, doesn't matter. We got buildings everywhere. I don't think those buildings should be open 6 hours a day. I think those buildings should be open 10, 12, 14 hours a day. I think they should be open on Saturdays. I think they should be open on weekends. And so to ask a teacher to do all of that, that's probably a little bit too much. But you think about a school day shift, and you think about an after-school shift with after-school providers and churches and nonprofits coming in, and whether it's the arts, which we haven't talked about, whether it's financial literacy, whether it's coding, whether it's foreign languages. Think about what are you doing for kids for over a 12-hour span. Think about not 2 meals a day, think about 3 meals a day for kids that are hungry. Think about those schools being safe places. So for me, it's what are we doing not just as schools traditionally, but as buildings. And I talk a lot about schools as community centers. And where schools truly become community centers in the heart of the community, we had 150 schools in Chicago, South and West Sides. We would have 100, 150 parents coming for their own education every single day, GED, ESL, family literacy nights, family counseling. When families are learning together, I promise you good things are going to happen for those kids. So we need more time. It's not just asking teachers to perform miracles, but how do we, school systems, churches, nonprofits, social service agencies, YMCAs, how do we come together and think very, very differently about our schools becoming community centers?
Thank you. And one very short follow-on. Are you thinking about running for president?
You have, it's just like Chicago, we just had like 15 candidates in Chicago, we're down to 2. We got about 23 candidates now, and we need one of them to win.
But you've got a major concern that certainly deserves more attention. Thank you.
I plan to help them all.
Unfortunately, this question, the next is going to be the last one, and I apologize to those of you in line.
It's my fault. It's not your fault. It's my fault.
Well, it's because it's been a riveting conversation, so I'll go to you.
Hi, my name is Gabrielle Zui. I'm studying political science here at Montgomery College. So in Montgomery County Public Schools, there was a very unique policy adopted in the past school year, which allows high school students up to 3 excused absences for what is considered to be civic engagement throughout the year. So if they're missing a day of school to go to a congressional hearing in DC, or to help run a voter registration drive, or to go to a protest, that is excused the same way that a doctor's note would be. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on this policy and other policies like this that get students involved in their local community and government without, basically with the school's permission, and also in specifically underserved school districts where attendance is a huge problem already. Are policies like this, or maybe programs that are implemented into the schools like this, feasible? Because attendance is already such an issue, but getting involved in the community might be a great thing.
That's a great last question. It's my first time hearing of a policy like that, so it's actually really interesting to me. So one, I'll try and answer it succinctly. We need to be encouraging young people to be engaged civically. It's hard to learn those skills as an adult. It's much better to learn those as an elementary or middle or high school student. I don't like the idea of excusing kids out of school. For me, it's how do we make this part of the curriculum? So how does this become part of what we do in social studies or in English, or as part of a service learning requirement? And so for me, it's not like we have school and then we have service. It's how do we integrate these things into a more cohesive whole? So students need to be engaged. And then I'll say, I think the best learning is always hands-on learning. So if you want to teach civics, if you want to teach history, if you want to teach about the 3 branches of government and checks and balances, best way to do that is to go visit the Supreme Court, to go visit something. Obviously, you have a unique opportunity here in this region to do that. So the short answer is I love the idea or the concept behind that this is important. I'd like to continue to push people to figure out how we better integrate this. It's just sort of seamless in terms of what we're doing in social studies, in history, in service learning, in English, whatever it might be. How does it become just a normal part of a student's experience so that every student has a chance to learn and to serve and to participate?
Thank you.
So I'm sorry that we have to end. I think there's great passion around conversations around education, as this conversation indicates. I'm very deeply grateful to Arne Duncan for being here today and his candid and thoughtful responses to questions I pose and questions from the audience, and certainly the work that you're doing that I think can be transformative in the city of Chicago. I know I'm completely biased as you are, but I know for a fact that work is needed, and I know for a fact that it can change lives. If we can do it one person at a time, I think the ripple effect, that compounding effect, can be significant. So thank you for what your work and service. Would you all please join me in thank you, Arne, for
Thanks
being
for the
here?
opportunity. Thanks so much.
I also want to thank just a few other people. I want to thank Bethesda Magazine for their media sponsorship. I happen to know that quite a few of you knew about this event because of their work, so thank you for that. I also want to thank the Meyer Foundation for their generous sponsorship and their belief that these types of conversations can be transformative for communities. So thank you, Nikki, so much for the support of the Meyer Foundation. I also want to thank our internal team, our special events people, Dr. Megan Gibbons from my office, who stalked Arne down, MCTV, to our Rockville campus for hosting us today. And just to announce, our next dialogue will be on April 30th. We're at the Rockville campus, most likely in the evening, where we will be having the Honorable Ike Leggett, former county executive, who will serve as a guest that evening for our dialogue. Thank you all so much. I hope that you take these conversations back home with you and to the communities in which you work and live and serve, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you all so much.